All right, so if you're joining in with us, we are again continuing our study of 1 Samuel. And tonight we are picking up in chapter 24, which is where we left off last week, looking at an occasion where, again, David has had the opportunity to kill Saul. And as a result of this, as we've been talking about, Saul had said a lot of bad things about David, had portrayed David as a traitor to Israel, as a man that was basically looking for any advantage he could to get over to Saul to take his life. And as we've noted, chapter 24 is sort of a record of how actually David doesn't follow through, or he doesn't resemble the type of man that Saul portrays him to be. But where we're picking up in chapter 24, we're going to see basically Saul's reaction to the statements that David has made, right, in chapter 24. So, right after David had cut off the robe, or part of Saul's robe, we know again that he had a change of heart. He decided to, as we talked about last week, an act that was understood to be an act of aggression on David's part. David turned that around and turned it into sort of an act of mercy to demonstrate this towards Saul. And that was, of course, through the cutting of the robe and how David portrays and shows that to Saul. Let me get to my place in my Bible. All right, so in 24, what David follows up and says to Saul, basically, as we talked about last week, David was a man that was going to let the Lord handle it, right? He understood that he had we all understood David and Saul have a problem here. And as we talked about last week, if we think about the court system in Israel based on Deuteronomy chapter 19, about how a case like this would be handled, where a man has been bearing false witness against another. We talked about how that particular case would go to court, and we talked about how whenever it went to court, the priests and the judges presided over it to figure out who's the innocent party. And as we noted, because Saul had basically destroyed or tried to destroy the priesthood a few chapters earlier in the city of Nob, and David took Abiathar and told Abiathar that I will protect you. David again had the priest on his side, so to speak, in a situation like this, right? Abiathar is not going to betray his protector to support the man that killed a lot of his family. He's not going to do that. And so we pointed out that David really had all the advantages here in the court system, so to speak, yet David doesn't act on that. He simply says again, I'm going to let God handle the matter. As he said in verses 12 and 15, the Lord judge between me and thee. And then verse 15, the Lord therefore let him be the judge. Let him judge between me and thee. And as we talked about before, there are some times in life where, we may not have the ability to correct a problem per se. And that may require us sometimes to, allow the Lord to work in His own time to solve those issues whenever we might have problems with other people. And so where we pick up in verse 16 is basically Saul's response to David. And let's go ahead and look at verse 16 of the text. All right, so verse 16, it came to pass when David had made an end of speaking these words unto Saul, that Saul said, Is this thy voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. And then we'll look at verse 17 in a minute. Now you note here that after David has basically told Saul that, I have spared your life, we know that Saul has grief. And you think about the situation, perhaps Saul, it comes to the realization about how close he was to death. You think about people that have experienced near-death situations, whether that's a serious car wreck or some type of injury or something like that. Generally, people are shaken up when that sort of thing happens, right? I think it's natural, when you come to grasp about how close you were to the point of death, it can cause you to express a little bit of grief or sort of shock you and wake you up. Perhaps that's what Saul's experiencing here. As we know that he weeps here. Now, there is a part of us, I think, as we've read, if we read through 1 Samuel, we see over the course of time how Saul, it seems like he expresses grief and then he changes his mind, and then later on David does something else and Saul's sorry again, and then Saul seems to change his mind towards David. And perhaps, there's the thought in our mind here, is Saul actually being genuine with what he's about to say here? I think that's a natural question that would pop in our minds, right? Because we've talked about what Saul has done before. And as we're going to see, perhaps David has some reservations about what Saul has said up to this point, or at least trusting him. Again, when you look at verse 16, you do see some details here that would seem to show that Saul has changed. Look at how he refers to David in the verse. Again, he says, "Is this thy voice, my son David?" You remember back, I believe it was verse 11, David addressed Saul as his father. And we talked about, again, Saul was David's father-in-law. We mentioned that in the book of 2 Kings that Naaman's servant called him a father. It was a title of respect. And likewise, Saul here addressing David by using the word son, this is a title of, what generally thought to be a title of sincerity or a title of compassion and care. Who did Paul often refer to as his son, spiritually speaking? Timothy, right? And we know that Paul and Timothy got along, right? We know that they were not enemies at all. And Paul used the word son there as as sort of to show his concern, his compassion for Timothy as his own son in the faith. Likewise, the word son here carries the same idea, right? There's a sense of concern. After all, Saul, through the marriage of his daughter, is related to David. You also note here that he lifts up his voice and wept. Sometimes we think about crying. We think about, maybe pictures of people that are, maybe not pictures, but we've seen maybe videos of people that you can tell are crying, but it doesn't seem like it's, they're just shedding tears, but they're able to basically control their emotions, relatively speaking. But the picture here is that you almost have Saul, completely sobbing, loud, the loud, emotional, this is something that you could hear. It's not something that you'd have to look at Saul, and that's the only way you could tell that he was crying. You could hear him crying is the idea. And that would seem to show, that this is a genuine emotion. A genuine emotion that Saul is experiencing. Now, of course, we may think in our minds, what type of sorrow is this? Is this, Saul being actually sorry for his prior actions, or is this, as we're going to see, Saul is sort of feeling sorry for himself because he's going to have to admit that David is a better man than himself, which is what he does moving forward. And so, what we see here with David, or what we see here with Saul is, again, he seems like a man that wants to change. Now, there is something that I want us to think about here that comes out in verses 16 through 22, is that, and it really happened back in the beginning when David first talked to Saul. But one thing that you note here is that David is keeping his distance from Saul. Now, I want you to go back to verse 8 in the text, right? 1 Samuel 24, verse 8. This is when David goes and initiates this conversation with Saul. David also arose afterward and went out of the cave and cried after Saul. And the picture here is, and what we can tell from the verses following, it's not as though David went and, it's not as though David went and got really close to Saul to talk to him. The idea there of crying after Saul would denote that there is a considerable distance between David and Saul when David is making this when David is making this speech that we looked at last week. There's a little bit of distance there, and that's noted by the word after in verse 8. Now you note now in verse 16, again, we can tell that there's distance between David and Saul because of two things, right? Saul has to clarify, is this David's voice, right? Is this David's voice? Saul knew David very well. He would have known what David sounded like. And so, there would be no reason to ask David this question. Likewise, if Saul and David are right next to one another, Saul would not have to ask, is this David's voice? Because he could tell that that's David standing right there in front of him, right? And so the picture here is that David and Saul are communicating from a little bit of distance away. So Saul cannot clearly see David. But what that indicates to us, perhaps, is that David is not wanting to get close to Saul. And what that could indicate to us is that maybe David has a little bit of doubt about Saul's apparent behavioral change, right? If David, you think about the position that David's in, he's keeping his distance because Saul has done this before, right? Where he said, David, I'm going to do better. We recall that Jonathan tried to reconcile David and Saul, and Saul said that he would not go after David anymore, only for Saul to go around and betray what he said, right? And so David has that in mind. And so perhaps he keeps his distance because he doesn't fully trust that Saul has completely changed. One passage that I'll mention that sort of connects with this, in John chapter 2, verses 23 through 25, we read about Jesus performing miracles and that he was beginning basically to sort of gain a large following. But I want you to note what is recorded about Jesus' actions in John chapter 2, verse 24. So John 2:23, many people believe the miracles which Jesus did. But verse 24, but Jesus did not commit himself unto them because he knew all men, and needed not that any should testify a man, for he knew what was in man. And so the indication there in verse 24, the idea that he did not commit himself unto them, was that he did not get close. He did not get close to all of these individuals like, say, he did with his apostles. And perhaps the reason why is that maybe some of these people that came and believed the miracles which he did, maybe they weren't genuine in their belief. And so, verse 25, he knew what was in man, or he knew what man's thoughts were. He could tell who was genuine and who was not. And so, Jesus wasn't going to entrust himself to all these individuals because some of them might not be genuine. And so, sort of the same idea here, right? David has a question, is Saul actually being very genuine? And if he has that question, it's best to keep distance apart from Saul. Now, a point of application we could bring out here is that, it can be extremely hard to win trust back if you have lost that trust, right? It can be extremely hard to win back trust. You think about in a marriage situation, right, where a spouse cheats on the other spouse. That relationship is not always mended overnight. Sometimes that takes a lot of time for that relationship to be mended if they choose to go that route and try to fix the marriage. In a situation where a spouse cheats on another spouse, the spouse that cheated, it's hard to win the trust back of the spouse that they cheated on, right? You think about in the workplace, you think about people that perhaps that have been caught embezzling money from a company and things like that. Those type of individuals are not easily win their trust back with their employer, or if they're in prison, they get out of prison, they move on to another job, and the employer looks at their record and sees that they've embezzled money. Well, that employer is naturally going to have trust issues with his employee, right, because of what he's done in the past. And so, that's something for us to think about as Christians, the importance of trust and trying to keep, Paul talked about, we Paul and Peter both mentioned that we try to keep things honorable among all men, or we keep our walk or our conduct honest among, not just members of the church, but among those that are non-Christians as well, because, if we lose somebody's trust, it can be extremely hard to win it back. And in this particular situation, right, David has great reason to not trust Saul, to be genuine. And so it would be hard for Saul to win that trust back. And we talked about verse 16 a lot, but the rest of this chapter we'll move through relatively quickly. Verses 17 through 20. Verse 17, and he said to David, Thou art more righteous than I, for thou hast rewarded me good, whereas I have rewarded thee evil. Let's go ahead and move on to 18 and 19. All right, verse 18, Thou hast showed this day how that thou hast dealt well with me, for as much as when the Lord had delivered me into thine hand, thou killedst me not. For if a man find his enemy, will he let him go well away? Wherefore the Lord reward thee good, for that thou hast done unto me this day. All right, move the slide back for me to verse 17, if you would, Dad. All right, verse 17. So Saul calls David, right, a righteous man. Right, thou art more righteous than I. Here's a good definition of what it means to be righteous, or at least a partial definition we could say. What does it mean to be righteous? Well, one quality of someone who is righteous is that they have a tendency to do good unto all people, and especially unto all people, and especially unto people that are their enemies. I've thought about this. I thought about the example of Daniel, right, in Daniel chapter 6. What happens in Daniel chapter 6, by the way? Very famous story about Daniel not bowing down to the, not worshiping Nebuchadnezzar, and not worshiping Darius, and what happens to Daniel because he doesn't worship Darius? They throw him in a lion's den, right? And you recall what happens afterward, right? That the angel of God preserves Daniel from being eaten. Darius, who was upset because he liked Daniel, comes back and sees that Daniel's still alive. And in Daniel chapter 6, verse 21, Daniel's first words to the man that basically had him thrown in the lion's den was, my Lord and my King. And, Daniel didn't say anything derogatory about Darius. He wasn't disrespectful to Darius, but he gave Darius respect. He returned, he was given evil and he returned that with good. Romans chapter 12, verse 21, Paul gives that same thought, right? Be not overcome with evil, but overcome evil with what? Overcome evil with good. And that's what Saul is pointing out here, right? All the bad things that he has done to David, David has overcome evil by doing good, by preserving Saul's life. Solomon would go on to later say something that really ties in well with that, and that's in Proverbs 16 and verse 7, where Solomon says in that passage, when a man's ways please the Lord, he maketh even his enemies to be at peace with him. When a man's ways please the Lord, he maketh even his enemies to be at peace with him. And that's Proverbs 16, verse 7. Right, David, as we talked about, David was going to let God handle the matter, right? He was not going to take revenge into his own hands. And like the writer of Proverbs said there, David's ways pleased the Lord. It was in accordance with what God would want him to do, and know that he maketh even his enemies to be at peace with him. And we'll see here, because of Saul's disposition, Saul is at peace at this moment with David, because David trusted in following and doing what God said about handling this matter. So David's a righteous man. Now, this is also important, not just verse 17, but verses 18 and 19. Again, Saul has explained why David is more righteous than him. This is also a very important point to make in connection with what Saul has said about David, that he was a traitor, that he wanted to take advantage of Saul whenever he got the chance. It's one thing for, the writer of Samuel to show that David is a righteous man, but when you have the man that is really the source of all of David's problems saying that David is a righteous man, that is a powerful witness to how good of a person that David has been at this point, right? We talked about later on that there were some that questioned whether or not David was responsible for the destruction of Saul's house. But if you have this record here of Saul saying that David is a righteous man, you know that David was always in the right, or David, that God was on David's side, whereas God was not on Saul's side at all. At least in terms as how we talked about it before. Go ahead and move back to verse 18 for me, Dad. Verse 18, there's another phrase I want to look at again. The end of that verse, for as much as when the Lord had delivered me into thine hand. Now we keep in mind that a couple chapters earlier, Saul told his men that God would deliver David into his hand. Now here we have Saul acknowledge firsthand that it was actually God that delivered, that God had delivered Saul himself into David's hand, right? And that's very important because, again, Saul is specifically acknowledging that God was on David's side in the matter. So all those bad things that Saul said about David couldn't have been true. In verse 19, Saul also provides his own proverb, or provides another well-known proverb in response to David's proverb back in verse 14 and 15. There Saul says, verse 19, for if a man find his enemy, will he let him go well away? What does Saul mean by that?
Not take his life, let him go on and live. Have mercy on him, I guess you'd say.
Right. Have mercy on him. What Saul's just the question that he asked here, right? If David was really Saul's enemy, David would not let Saul go away without being punished, right? It's sort of a rhetorical question here, right? If a man finds his enemy, you know that the man will destroy his enemy, is what Saul's saying. But because David has preserved me, David is not my enemy, is what he's acknowledging there. And that goes against all the bad things that Saul has said about David. Now, go on to verse 20 because he continues on. Right, so he said all these nice things about David, but then verse 20, again, very important. Now, behold, I know well that thou shalt surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in thine hand. So not only is David a good person, and he's not like he's not the same type of man that those bad rumors that I've been talking about David, but here in verse 20, Saul says, now I acknowledge that David will be the next king of Israel. And so, later on, whenever David would face challengers and opponents, as we'll see at the beginning of the book of 2 Samuel, note that Saul actually acknowledged that David would be the next king. Just as Samuel had anointed David, just as God had told Samuel that David would be the next king, here's David's chief enemy in his life saying that David will be the next king. We think back to that verse we looked at in 1 Peter about, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles or among non-Christians, that when they speak evil of you, that when the day of visitation comes or the day in which basically the account is settled, you're found to be innocent. You were cleared of all wrongdoing. And so that's sort of what happens here, right? David has kept his conduct honest. As best as he could. He didn't take David's life, or didn't take Saul's life. And now that, in a sense, the day of visitation or the day of accounting has come, and Saul recognizes that David is a righteous man. It's also the same thing for us when we think about it as Christians as well. Again, there are times when we have problems with people, but if we try to keep our conduct honest and we try to do everything right as God would have it to do, later on, we'll be found to be innocent in the matter, so to speak, right? just like David here is, because he's trying to do everything right. And that's an important principle for us to keep in mind. When we have problems with other people, we need to, we need to abide by what God said, but we need to do things right? We don't want to, if people are saying bad things about us, we don't want those bad things to be proven to be true, right? We want to be a good, upstanding citizen, so to speak. And Saul acknowledges that. So verses 21 and 22, Saul wants David to make an oath. Swear now therefore unto me by the Lord that thou wilt not cut off my seed after me, and that thou wilt not destroy my name out of my father's house. And David sware unto Saul, and Saul went home but David and his men gat them up unto the hold. Basically what Saul wants is for David to show mercy to his family. Verse 21, do not cut off my seed after me. Do not destroy my name out of my father's house. Now what Saul asked David here would go against conventional wisdom for David in this situation. Because if David's going to become the next king of Israel, and there are still sons and relatives of Saul living, you could very well have problems, right, about people wanting to side with Saul's family. Generally, whenever a situation like this would happen where, a king that was not from the prior king's household becomes king, he would have to kill off the relatives of the former king. That was something that was natural. That was something that was seen to protect the legitimacy of the new king's kingdom. But and conventional wisdom would say that if David wanted to protect his position as king, he needs to eliminate the family members of Saul. But so Saul asked David here something that would go against conventional wisdom. And it turns out that David is going to protect Saul's family to some extent. We'll see in 2 Samuel chapter 9, one of Jonathan's sons, Mephibosheth, who would have been Saul's grandson, David's actually going to treat him very well. And that not only fulfills the oath that he makes to Saul here, but that fulfilled the oath that David made to Jonathan back in chapter 20. And so David's going to be faithful to this oath that he makes to Saul. Now, one final thing that I'll mention about this chapter before we move on. We've talked about how there is distance between David and Saul in this situation. Now, note that after it seems like they have got their problems reconciled, right? That Saul has acknowledged that David is not his enemy. You would think they would all get along, and then David would go back to live in the palace of the king and to, basically have his family around his father-in-law. You would think that's what happens, but that's not what happens. Verse 22, David makes the oath. Note that Saul went home, and then you have the word but, right? But David and his men gat them up unto the hold. So note by the end of this situation that David still remains separated from Saul. He doesn't return to take his position right by Saul's side. And perhaps that shows to us that, again, David doesn't fully trust Saul at this point, which is why they remain separated. Even though it seems like they've worked out their issues, Saul has finally acknowledged that David isn't his enemy. Perhaps David, again, is still a little bit skeptical of Saul's intentions. All right, now, verse 22, we're going to look at the map in a moment. And that's probably, we're probably not even going to get into chapter 25 tonight, but note that David and his men, it says that they gat them up unto the hold. If you've got another translation, what do you have there for the word hold? Stronghold. And so what you naturally might think here is that Saul returns to his palace in Gibeah, and then David and his men remain there in the city of En-Gedi. However, the word hold there is actually referring to another place. If we go back in our Bibles to 1 Samuel 22, verse 1, and then verses 4 and 5, there are two possible locations where David and his men go to next. All right, so 1 Samuel 22, verse 1, David, we remember there that David and his men, they escaped to the cave of Adullam, and that's where his father's house meets with him. All right, so they're in the cave of Adullam. Now we remember that David takes his family to Moab, right, to protect them there. And he brought them before the king of Moab, and they dwelt with him all the while that David was in the hold. And the hold there, it would refer to the stronghold, or it would refer to a fortress. So we know that there was a fortress there in Moab, or the word stronghold. We know that there was one of those in Moab. But note verse 5, the prophet Gad said unto David, Abide not in the hold, depart and get thee into the land of Judah. Then David departed and came into the forest of Hereth. Hang on, I may have gotten that backwards. I may have to go back and look at that again. There are actually two different holds. There was one there in Moab, but there's also one in Adullam. And the point being is that at the end of chapter 24, when it says that David and his men gat them up in the hold, they didn't remain there in En-gedi, but more than likely they went back to Adullam, which is where they were in chapter 22, because there was a stronghold there at one point. With that being said, are there any comments or any thoughts that you'd like to add on to what we've talked about?
I think one reason why Saul wept also, he's just ashamed of how he's been acting. I mean,
Yeah.
he knows how David is acting in a godly way, and he looks at how he's been after David. He has no justification for killing David. He knows that. But again, he's just absolutely ashamed that, like you say, he doesn't last long. He just goes right back again.
Right, and Paul noted something about that in 2 Corinthians, about the sorrow of the world versus godly sorrow. Godly sorrow worketh repentance, but as Paul was talked about there, the sorrow of the world worketh death, or the point that Saul was making is that worldly sorrow typically is only sorry for a time, doesn't want to make lasting changes, whereas the godly sorrow that leads to repentance means that you're willing to make lasting changes to be obedient to God, which Saul, of course, was not willing to do. All right, I'm going to stop the live stream here, and let me back that up.